Welcome back to Alabama Gristmill. First part of spring here, grass growing and the trees blooming, and the good weather coming around. Yeah, say hello to my co-host, Donna Causey.
Hello. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we'll say welcome back to the listeners. We've enjoyed the feedback and the sharing of the podcast. We really appreciate it. It really helps us out here, getting the word out about what we're doing here, and hopefully you're enjoying it. Yeah. And I know we've got a couple of people we want to mention.
Paul Hawthorne was real nice in mentioning it and sharing it with others. Thank him for doing that. And some of the people from the Selma Pilgrimage shared the podcast too. We appreciate that because word of mouth is more effective a lot of times than anything else. When people already hear you.
Yeah, it's pretty much the main thing going on out there. So that's we really appreciate that out there, and we don't really have any sponsors, but right now, but the way to support us is purchasing our series of books, which is the Alabama Footprint series, and you can find those at Amazon.com, or you request them at your local bookstore.
Any books by Donna R. Causey on Amazon support this site and the podcast. So go to Amazon and look for Donna R. Causey.
We're not a big group here, but we're doing it out of a labor of love and enjoying sharing these history and everything. So any help's appreciated. And if you want to just give a donation, we have a button on the website where you can actually just give a donation via PayPal. So just kind of look for that there. So anything to help us out. So because we're getting a lot of downloads and a lot of computer stuff happening on the back end, which takes a lot of resources, and anything to do to help offset those costs is definitely appreciated. So
definitely,
if you can't do anything, no biggie, enjoy it.
Yeah, that's what we say.
We keep it free. The best thing is just share it and like it, interact with us, and if you have any questions,
like I say,
of course.
It's a labor of love. That's what it amounts to.
It is. And we've got a story today, or I guess a telling of a time in history where it was right after the Revolutionary War. A lot of interesting land grabs going on. I want to talk about a couple of land frauds that happened that were very, very large land frauds.
Very, very, very big and very interesting. I was sitting in a library one time and discovered this, and I realized that this is why a lot of people came to Alabama, because of these two particular land frauds, because they got stuck in the middle of something. They didn't know how to get out of it, so they just gave up and moved on. Right after the Revolutionary War and the Louisiana Purchase and everything, land west was the big thing, because the tobacco land up in the Northeast was wearing out, and people were looking for more land to start and build again, and they heard of all this great land in the Mississippi Territory, which Alabama was a part of. They headed down that way. The state of Georgia decided since we won the Revolutionary War, they thought, well, we own all that land down there, and they decided they'd claim all the land between the Chattahoochee River and the Mississippi River as the state of Georgia. Of course, they didn't have any right to do that necessarily, but they decided to do that. President Washington was kind of not liking that too much, because the Native Americans still owned the land, and Spain still possessed some of it. So he was afraid that it'd wind up going back to Spain. They didn't own it, but they were living there. It got real interesting for a while, trying to determine what to do about it, when the four land companies in Georgia organized for the purpose of buying up the land and selling it, becoming speculators and reselling it. The first land was sold by Georgia around the Yazoo River, which is actually in Mississippi. So that's why they were called the Yazoo companies. Four companies formed to sell the land. Spain claimed ownership, and Georgia felt they had the right to sell the claims for the land. But the Yazoo company bought 14 million acres for the small price of $207,580. Can you believe that? I mean, 14 million acres of land.
Yeah. That's a slightly significant amount of land.
They acquired that, and these four companies got together and started selling it off. Spain still controlled Mississippi, and it wouldn't allow the settlers to use the river for the commerce. And this presented problems for the early planters who bought some of the land. So Spain offered, well, we'll give you the right if you become Spanish subjects. George Washington was kind of worried. He thought, we're getting this land, and now it's going to go right back to Spain. He was a little upset about the whole situation. And they kept negotiating with the Yazoo Land Company in Georgia and trying to come up with a solution. They never came around to it. Finally, James Gunn, a United States Senator from Georgia, got involved in it. Their company was granted the 40 million acres of land for about $500,000.
Yeah, just for reference, that's a little bit larger than the size of Georgia. You know, I mean, that 40 million acres.
That included Alabama too. At that point, you know, you're talking about the Alabama land, and it got to be a big thing. You know,
Alabama's only 32 million acres, I believe. That's what it is.
But that was a big, you know, $500,000 was a big influx of money to the state of Georgia. So I mean, they felt like it'd be a good thing, but they didn't guarantee anything about the land. Here we had Native Americans living on it all over it, and Spanish citizens living on it, and you bought it, but you weren't sure you were going to be able to get it. Is what it amounted to. To get the legislature to pass the bill and all, they bribed representatives. It wound up being 20 senators and about 34 representatives are bribed to make the sale with gifts and money or even shares of the land from the land companies. Anyway, it got to be you can imagine, it got to be a big debate across the country. Georgia felt like they had the right to claim all the land that made up the future state of Alabama. I don't know how they figured they had the right, but they figured they did. State convention finally met after the passage of what they called the Yazoo Act for selling all the land and condemned the sale, and the sale was a big issue in the elections that followed. Finally, in February 1796, a rescinding measure was passed. They were told that the purchase money that was already in the treasury had to be refunded and the whole sales voided. You can imagine what happened then, because I mean, people had already bought the land. They were moving into the area, so it was a mess. The speculators panicked because here, you know, they were going to lose all this land, and they still wanted to make money. So what they did, they went further west and started selling it off to people who didn't know and made profit. And a lot of the speculators made a lot of profit, and that included a lot of legislatures and senators.
Yeah, they kind of made out like bandits.
They did. I mean, the ones that first bought it really did. And I mean, here these unsuspecting people were buying up this land like crazy, you know, thinking they were getting a good deal, and it was all going to go back. You can imagine when they came to try to settle on their land, they discovered what had happened. In 1798, Congress authorized the president to come to an agreement about the lands in dispute. And finally, Georgia just said, well, the heck with it. You know, I'm going to give up all the lands, but they got paid additional. They gave up all the land for $1,250,000. So they really made out well, too. The people that had the land, they began to rush to Washington about this time and say, hey, wait a minute. We own this land. We can't give it up. You know, we bought it fair and square. We didn't know about this. And they were getting petitions from people from all over the country, and it was just a mess for a long time. A commission was finally formed in 1803 to look into the Yazoo matter. The report stated that all the lands that had passed through the hands of the original speculators, it had to be clear that they had title to it. But they said they should have no claims against the speculators by reason of defect. They went back to the original speculators and looked at the deeds and went from there.
They have to go after the speculators and not the federal government. They want them to go after the speculators for their refunds.
Exactly
and that
right.
made the claimants furious, didn't it?
Right. They were. Well, I mean, can you imagine if you were just a everyday citizen and you bought this land and you couldn't get anything, you had no recourse of action for the a land that you had bought and that you probably were living on at that point. They finally came up with $5 million to pay these people, which was probably just a token, 10 cents on a dollar, probably what they paid for it. But anyway, they just settled the claims. What happened is Congress decided they didn't agree with the idea, and with the commissioners, and they didn't appropriate the funds. So the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was held that the rescinding act was an unconstitutional right of contract, where they were going to get their money back. Congress finally passed an act in 1814. They did split up the $5 million to settle all that Yazoo claims, and it was not enough, but it did some, since they said it wasn't right to treat them that way. But that was a major claim called the Yazoo claims, and that's a lot of people wound up, their land in Alabama was involved in all that. And
especially with Georgia with the 40 million acres, I mean, of course, it's going to cover Alabama.
Oh, yeah. You can imagine imagine how many people were already coming in here. I mean, Native Americans had not sold their land to anybody. They were coming in being pushed out because of all these claims. People, unsuspecting, thought they had bought clear land in Alabama, and they didn't really have anything when it came down to it. And if they weren't one of the lucky ones that got some of that money, they just lost it completely, all of it. Some of them probably moved, some of them probably just stayed. The Yazoo fraud was a big one for Georgia.
There was the other one around the same time, right?
Yeah, it was around the same time that affected Tennessee. You've got to remember, North Carolina and Tennessee were kind of the same area for a long time until Tennessee became a state. And so
North Carolina extended over into Tennessee.
Right.
Right.
And then they split off and Tennessee became its own state.
And that some of that is probably northern Alabama, I imagine.
Yeah. Northern Alabama and Tennessee and North Carolina. That area in there was all one area under North Carolina, a good bit of it was. A lot of times you'll find that people, you say, well, they were in North Carolina and then they were in Tennessee. They may not have moved at all. It might have been just the lines of states drawn up and they just moved. So it's kind of interesting. You need to study your history for that reason when you're looking for your family, because that happens a lot with counties and everything. But anyway, let's get back to the land fraud.
So the other big land. So let's go ahead and go into the other big land fraud.
Yeah.
What was the name of that fraud?
The Glasgow land fraud. And it was in 1789, and it was the land that was reserved for the North Carolina Revolutionary War veterans. What happened in that situation? Andrew Jackson discovered the land fraud, believe it or not. He was a young congressman at the time, and he began noticing that in Nashville at the surveyor's office, things were a little suspicious, and it involved officials in both Tennessee and North Carolina. That's what really got it interesting about this one.
And this was definitely before the Tennessee was a state, because I think their statehood was around 1796, so this was about 7 years before they were the state.
Yeah, it involved the North Carolina Revolutionary War veterans. So if you had some people that were involved in the Revolutionary War, they were granted land in Tennessee, because that's what they were trying to do, is go and get their land. The land granted to them had to be surveyed, though. The problem was the Native Americans were still living on the land, and so they didn't particularly want you to come down there and survey their land and take it over.
Yeah, we're going to come down here and measure this up and give it away from you. Take it away from you.
Yeah, take it away from you. They didn't particularly like that, so the survey went kind of slow. Soldiers frequently gave up and just sold their land to any speculator at some low price, because it wasn't worth waiting for. Because a lot of these Revolutionary War veterans were kind of old at that point. They had fought a long battle. Some of them were quite ill. Some of them were wounded and whatever. They'd rather have the money than trying to fight and get the land that they had been granted. And Andrew Jackson discovered that there were deeds that had been executed to dead veterans after that land had been granted. Can you believe that? I mean,
I can believe it.
There was not so much follow. You can't follow things as closely back during those days. By the time paperwork gets followed somebody, then they might be dead or whatever. Anyway, these deeds were sold to unsuspecting buyers for a good profit, because the speculators were everywhere. Another thing the speculators did is they'd go and find a commander who fought during the Revolutionary War, and they'd take him out and have a nice little party and get him drunk and really well intoxicated. Then they'd find some person on the street and they'd say, hey, here's this guy signed up. Didn't he fight under you? The commander would be drunk. He'd sign a thing, a statement saying that, yes, he did fight under me, whether he did or not. Probably, most likely not. So land was being granted to that stranger on the street. Then the speculator immediately buy the land right back from him, so he'd get hold of the grant that way. So a lot of speculators wound up with the Revolutionary War grant and got it real cheaply that way. Then they'd sell it off to unsuspecting people trying to come into Tennessee and Alabama too, North Alabama, mainly in North Alabama. When Andrew Jackson kind of opened up the door and said, hey, this is going on down here, a commission was set up to investigate and invalidate the deeds that were acquired illegally. They had a time trying to sort through that, though. That was a mess. They had to just finally go back to the first person who got the grant to be sure that he was a Revolutionary War veteran, because they had rows of the Revolutionary War veteran. You can imagine it could have been sold 2 or 3 times. The one who wound up having the property at the end may have just lost it, because he had an illegal deed from the beginning. So that happened to a lot of people. Some of them just probably came on into Alabama and tried to get some land down here after that, because they lost their property up there. Boy, the people, you can imagine how mad they were, though. Tempers were hot with people losing their land. And some of them, people had already built houses and planted crops on the land and still lost it completely. The commission was in constant danger, too. They had to keep jumping around and hiding, because you can imagine they were looking at all these records. If they found that you didn't own the land, then somebody might get a little angry and go after you. They had to hide where they were, and they go from town to town. The thing about it is, too, the State House, believe it or not, a lot of the records were at the State House. So somebody tried to burn it down, the State House down, so the documents
so they weren't even that far, huh?
Yeah.
So okay, we'll just get rid of all your documentations whatsoever.
3 men broke into the office and carried off a trunk. But anyway, they got caught. Peter Bird, a slave who worked there, wound up discovering what they had done and informed some other men, and they got it back. But the robbers got away. After this attempt, a guard had to be hired to protect the State House after that, because they were afraid that it'd get burned down. It almost happened. The commission had to meet in secrecy, and they moved frequently all over the state, and even in Tennessee, trying to stay out of people that were so angry.
So how far did this fraud go? Was it like just lower levels of government, or did it go up any higher?
Well, it wound up going to the Secretary of State, James Glasgow. That's why it's called the Glasgow fraud.
Also, pretty much almost the top, yeah. Even
his son-in-law, Willoughby Williams, was involved in it too, so I guess it was a family thing, pull everybody in. But anyway, some other officials were
land fraud's a family business.
Right. Land fraud was a family business back then. Anyway, John Bonds and John Gray Blunt and Thomas Blunt were all brought to trial over that. The Secretary of State and all, they were all brought to trial.
How much land was involved in this?
In 1799, they estimated, they didn't know completely, but they estimated that 700,000 acres had been accumulated through the scam by some 50 or so persons. That's how many people were involved in it that they tracked down. They didn't get them all. It was a mess, trying to find who was the original person, whether it was a Revolutionary War veteran or what. And the records are so messed up. And a lot of Tennessee and North Carolina have trying to track down records, and they can't find original grants and it was because of this fraud. Records disappeared. They tried to burn the State House down, but in other places they tried to destroy the records too, so you could never find out who was the original person to get the land. It's difficult to trace property that was involved in that, and it's still affecting the land today. That's why if you have some trouble trying to track it, there's a real reason for it.
Get your title insurance. Get your title insurance. That just kind of tells you how crazy times were right after the Revolutionary War. It still goes on today. It's like what we had in 2008 with the real estate market crash and all that. So, people get greedy. They did back then. They still do today.
Speculators always move in a situation like that and try to see what they can do. The people who have money try to grab up a lot of it and then sell it over to unsuspecting people. And kind of like, they used to say a long time ago in Florida when it was all swampland down there, people were trying to sell swampland a lot.
Well, this kind of shows, like we say, the history repeats itself.
Yeah,
we kind of try to learn.
It starts back since the very beginning.
Yeah, exactly. So imagine it happened before then, and it will continue to happen after. But it was an interesting time in Alabama history.
But it's good to know this kind of, because you understand why people moved and what impetus brought a bunch of people to Alabama. Why did they settle down here? Well, if you lost your land in Tennessee and you had a chance to get some land in Alabama, of course, that would be the thing to do. And so you just
a lot more moving around back then than it was.
A lot of people just left and began squatting in Alabama, on land that they didn't own, and that's another story we'll get into down the line. But when land started opening up a little bit after some Native Americans started ceding land to the government, and they jump over here and try to take advantage of it real quick, and basically drive off the Native Americans one way or another. So it's interesting. The more you look into land grabs and land frauds, you wonder, how we managed to even hold on to anything.
Well, if you want to find out more about this story or look at any more stories around the same land frauds and the settling of Alabama, remember you can always go to the website alabamapioneers.com and check it out. So, and with that, we'll probably go ahead and wrap this one up, and we'll see you later on this week. Probably have a podcast hopefully later on this week. With that, we'll say bye. And
we'll say bye for now, and watch out for your land. Be sure and get your title insurance today.
Yeah.
Don't let that happen to you again.
And we'll go out with a little bit of Alabama Jubilee. We'll see you next time.
One-legged Joe dancing round on his toes, throws away his crutch and hollers, hey, let her go, oh honey.